They said the child was a gift from God, but gifts don't drain the life from everything they touch. That line was redacted from the original medical journal, ripped out, burned, maybe, and yet it survived. A single sentence in a physician's letter folded behind the final page like a warning no one dared speak aloud. August 1877, Sedalia County, Missouri, a town that pretends it never knew the name Timothy Caldwell, but his name still circulates in hushed voices, in the black corners of family trees, in the creak of floorboards. No one dares walk after midnight. What they buried wasn't just a child, it was a phenomenon, a presence that walked like a boy, but moved like an idea, not one born in flesh, but assembled. This story doesn't begin with horror. It begins with careful notes, precise handwriting, and a physician, Dr. Samuel Harding, whose war-scarred eyes had seen everything except this. He called it the case that taught me the soul could be absent from a body still warm. Timothy was 8 when the accidents began. First, a little girl by the creek, then a man from the bluffs, then a child in a well, all found by Timothy, all explained by him. And yet, none of the deaths made sense, not in a world ruled by physics, nature, or innocence. Harding didn't see a murderer. He saw something worse, a child who understood death too well, who cataloged it, who studied it. This isn't a ghost story. It's not even about evil. It's about control, hidden intelligence, the kind that slips past every moral filter because it's wrapped in childhood. Timothy Caldwell wasn't sick. He wasn't possessed. He was programmed. This series of events, this cluster of calculated coincidences, all orbit one truth no one wanted to name. What if the boy wasn't human in the way we understand it? What if nature created a vessel but forgot to include the soul? Because behind Timothy, Ace's pale eyes was something that didn't blink when others cried, didn't flinch when others bled, something old, something watching, and tonight you're going to see how deep this story goes. But be warned, some truths are not meant to be remembered, some were made to be erased. And Timothy Caldwell was almost one of them. Dr. Harding's journals, 3 volumes of leather-bound horror, were never meant for public eyes. They weren't reports, they were confessions. A man trained in science, undone by what he couldn't explain. Timothy Caldwell, he wrote in blood-dark ink, is not like the others. He mimics emotion. He imitates grief. But I have never once seen him feel. In the fall of 1866, Harding began tracking Timothy's proximity to unexplained events. The results were chilling. Wherever the boy went, misfortune followed. Livestock deaths, structural collapses, children vanishing. No one could prove it, but everyone started to whisper. And still, Timothy remained untouchable. You see, predators hide behind chaos, but he hid behind order. He was always polite, always clean, a helpful farm boy who looked you in the eye, even as your instincts screamed to look away. One night, Harding followed Timothy into the woods. The moon was high, the trees skeletal, windless. For 2 hours, the child wandered without light, stepping over roots and through brush like he'd memorized every inch of the terrain. Harding kept his distance until Timothy stopped near a small clearing. That's when Harding saw it. A ring of carefully placed stones, bloodied feathers, and dissected animals laid out in what he could only describe as ritual symmetry. And Timothy? He knelt in the center, not crying, not praying, smiling, but not with joy. No, it was the smile of recognition, as if the shapes in the stones spoke to him, as if he understood. Harding retreated in silence. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he wrote down one sentence over and over in the margin of his journal. "I do not believe this boy is learning. I believe he is remembering." The next day, when Harding confronted Timothy gently, casually asking about his walk, the boy smiled, eyes pale and empty, and said, "I don't go into the woods, doctor. Aunt Sarah says it's dangerous." And with that, Harding understood the magnitude of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a child with strange instincts. This was an entity with a mask, and Sedalia was the stage. The deaths weren't random. They were patterns. Patterns he was testing. By winter, Sedalia's silence had grown thick. Families whispered behind drawn curtains. Children were kept inside. And still, Timothy moved through the town like fog, unnoticed until it was too late, not feared, not hated, just quietly avoided. Dr. Harding knew what they didn't. He had seen it with his own eyes. Timothy's fascination with anatomy, his near-obsessive recall of details around death, and worst of all, his hunger for knowledge that no child should possess. One evening in December 1866, Harding visited the Caldwell farm under the pretense of checking on Thomas's injured back, but the visit was a ruse. He had hidden a bundle of old Civil War medical illustrations in his bag, images so graphic most adults turned away. He laid them out in front of Timothy. The boy did not look away. In fact, he leaned in. "This one's leg was torn at the femoral artery," Timothy observed, "but he bled from the groin. That means the rupture extended into the iliac, doesn't it?" Harding froze. Those weren't the words of a curious child. They were the words of someone who knew, someone who had studied, or worse, someone who had seen it happen. That night, Harding wrote, "The boy's mind is a library of cruelty, but the shelves were never built. They came pre-filled." And that's when the theories began to form. Timothy's biological mother, dead from consumption. His father died in a prison camp, but there were no records, no grave markers. No one in town had ever seen them. What if Timothy wasn't brought to Sedalia? What if he had always been here, watching, and simply inserted himself when the timing was right? He had arrived with nothing but a cloth bag and those pale blue eyes that never cried. And now he lived at the center of a widening circle of psychological rot. And then came the event that no one could ignore. On the night of January 3rd, 1867, the Patterson barn caught fire. Eleanor and Samuel Patterson escaped, but their eldest son, Nathaniel, age 14, never made it out. His body was found just inside the door, arms burned, eyes wide open, lips curled in an expression of absolute terror. The fire marshal called it a lightning strike, but there had been no storm. And Dr. Harding? He found something else. A small footprint, bare but unmistakable, pressed in the soot outside the barn, leading toward the Caldwell farm. The same size as an 8-year-old boy. Dr. Harding didn't sleep that night, not because of the fire, but because of the expression on Nathaniel's face. It wasn't the look of a boy caught in smoke or trapped by flame. It was the look of someone who saw something before the fire took hold. Something that turned his final breath into a scream so silent it etched itself onto bone. By dawn, Harding had made his decision. He returned to the Caldwell farm, not with medicines or drawings this time, but with a Bible, a lantern, and a locked wooden case. Inside were instruments not meant for healing, but for revelation. He told Thomas and Miriam that he wished to examine Timothy for signs of malnourishment, but that was a lie. What he really wanted was time alone with the boy. Timothy sat on a stool, silent, unmoving, his eyes fixed not on Harding, but on the locked case. He knew. "You brought the sharp ones today," he said. "Do you think pain will make me tell you?" Harding's hands trembled. I don't want to hurt you, Timothy. The boy smiled, slowly. No, but you want to know what I am, don't you? Harding opened the Bible. You were made by God, same as anyone. Timothy tilted his head. Then why does God keep me awake at night, telling me what bones sound like when they beg? Harding snapped the Bible shut. He couldn't do it. Not to a child, not even this one. So he left. But as he crossed the field in the cold dawn light, he heard a sound behind him. Laughter. Not a child's giggle, not even human. It was guttural, split-toned, like it came from two throats at once. And when he turned back, Timothy was no longer on the porch, just the wind, just the frost on the windows, just the barn cat dragging something small and gray across the yard. Later that day, Eleanor Patterson visited Harding. She brought something she'd found in the ashes, her son's journal, charred at the edges, blown, illegible. The last entry read, "He was in the barn. I saw him, not a boy, a shape, no eyes, just skin, like wax. He called my name and I couldn't move. Mama, if you find this, he's not what he says. He's not from here, and he's not alone." Harding folded the journal and stared at the horizon, and in the distance, atop the Caldwell roof, stood Timothy. That night, Harding broke his oath as a man of science. He lit every oil lamp in his study, locked the doors, and unsealed a bundle he hadn't touched in over a decade. Father's old letters from Prussia. Among them were diagrams, heretical by church standards, and symbols he once thought nonsense. Circles within circles, names scratched out, margins filled with frantic warnings. One phrase repeated again and again. When flesh forgets its origin, it remembers its purpose. Harding no longer believed this was about mental illness, or even possession. It was something older. The next day, Harding returned to the Caldwell property, but this time he didn't knock. He marched straight to the barn where it all began. His boots cracked the frozen mud as he swung the rusted door wide. The stench hit him first, sweet and foul, like rotted fruit and candle wax. The loft above creaked, and then he saw the circle, charcoal black and etched into the barn's floor, candles all melted to the wick, animal bones in careful spirals. At the center, a burlap doll, its eyes missing, its mouth sewn shut with copper wire. A voice echoed from above. "You're not supposed to see that." Harding looked up. Timothy stood in the rafters. But his eyes, they weren't the dull gray of malnutrition. They glowed. Faintly, like coals too stubborn to die. "You were going to hurt me, weren't you?" the boy asked. Harding steadied his breath. "I came to understand you." Timothy cocked his head. "But you already do." He stepped off the beam and floated to the ground. No fall, no sound. His bare feet hovered just above the floorboards, dust swirling around him. "You think this is about evil, sin, possession, but it's older than that. I was born because the land asked for something back, something you all took without remembering the cost." Harding's voice cracked. It wasn't just water. What spilled from the Caldwell well was thick, clotting, dark, and steaming in the winter air. It pooled in the snow like ink, staining everything crimson. Miriam's hands were buried in it, her mouth trembling with prayers that made no sense, half Latin, half gibberish. Harding tried to pull her away, but she fought like a feral animal. "He's not the only one," she screamed. "They're all waking up now." Harding turned back toward the barn. The circle was smoldering. Timothy was gone. In his place, on the floorboards, was a blackened handprint, not like a child's, longer fingers, clawed, seared into the wood. That night, Harding wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania State Hospital requesting immediate relocation of the Caldwell child for safety and scientific containment. He also sent a second letter, unsigned, to a man he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Father Wilhelm Ehrich, an excommunicated priest once condemned for heretical exorcisms across Eastern Europe. Harding didn't sleep, neither did the town. Over the next week, 3 other families reported bizarre phenomena. A baby in the Whitmore home was found covered in ash, its crib charred, though there was no fire. A schoolteacher at Grace Chapel collapsed mid-lesson, vomiting live crickets, and old Sheriff Amos Clay was discovered in his own jail cell, eyes gouged out, the words, "Debt paid," carved into his chest, from the inside. The Caldwell house was placed under unofficial quarantine. Church elders visited Miriam daily, but no one was allowed inside the barn. Harding returned once, on the 7th day. The air was different, heavy, as though the sky itself were pressing down. The animals were long gone, not a crow, not a deer, even the dogs had stopped barking. Inside the barn, the charcoal circle had expanded, and within it, dozens of burlap dolls now stood, each with different faces, sewn from scraps of real clothing. Some had teeth, one had human hair, and in the rafters, written in dried blood, was a single phrase, "We do not forget." Harding backed out slowly. He wasn't sure if he'd been seen or if he was being allowed to leave. That night, he made a final decision. He would remove the boy from the family, secretly, quietly, not for science anymore, for survival. What Harding didn't know was this: the Caldwell child had already left the house, and he wasn't alone. He'd gone to Pitu, the church. The sanctuary was silent when the Caldwell child entered. It was past midnight, and Grace Chapel, built in 1792 with rotting beams and soot-blackened windows, should have been locked, but the doors stood wide open, as if waiting for him. The boy stepped in barefoot, clothes soaked with snowmelt and blood. He was humming again, the same off-key lullaby the townsfolk swore they'd heard from their basements, their attics, their dreams. Inside the chapel, the air was icy and stale, like the breath of a tomb. Candles that no one lit flickered along the pews. Every flame leaned toward the pulpit, where a single figure stood waiting. Father Graber, the interim priest, kind, feeble, half-blind. But now, he was on his knees, arms raised toward the child, weeping. "You've returned," he whispered, "as the smoke said you would." The boy nodded, not like a child, like something ancient remembering its lines. Father Graber crawled forward. "I've prepared the altar," and he had. The communion table had been stripped bare, replaced with a butcher's slab. Animal bones were arranged in strange spirals. A deer's heart pulsed, though it had no veins. The chalice overflowed not with wine, but ink-black blood that moved like oil in water. The boy stepped up, not hesitating, not afraid. He placed his tiny hand on the altar and spoke in a voice not his own. "Call them. They remember the smell of prayer." Graber obeyed. He reached under his robes and removed a long, thin knife. It had no shine. It was made of ball, obsidian. From a cave no map showed anymore. He raised it above the boy's palm, and just as the blade touched skin, a deafening crack shattered the chapel windows. Outside, lanterns, men with rifles, hardened eyes, hardened hearts. Harding had returned. Not with doctors, not with church elders, with 4 coal miners and a bottle of nitrogen. They stormed the chapel. Graber shrieked. The boy simply turned and smiled. Harding ordered the men to seize them both, but as they stepped forward, the chapel floor shifted beneath them, not like wood, but like flesh. The walls began to bleed, the crucifix melted, the Christ's face replaced by a screaming void, and somewhere above them, in the choir loft where no one stood, a child's voice sang, "The blood of the earth, the bones of the sky. We open the door, and none may ask why." Harding didn't hesitate. He lit the fuse. The chapel exploded. But no bodies were ever recovered, not even the Caldwell child. When dawn broke over the smoldering ruin of Grace Chapel, the town of Ashevale stood still. Smoke curled into the gray sky like incense from a cursed cathedral. The explosion had flattened the sanctuary. Timbers split like bones, stained glass ground to dust, and the steeple cast down like a fallen idol. But those who gathered at the edge of the wreckage said the strangest thing was the silence. No birds, no wind, no weeping, just a low hum, barely audible, like a child's lullaby drifting up from beneath the earth. Sheriff Harding stood with a bloodied bandage around his arm, teeth clenched. The 4 miners who'd followed him in had survived, but they wouldn't speak. One had torn out his own eyes by sunrise. Another walked into the frozen lake. The last 2 were found praying in Latin they'd never learned. The town asked questions. Where was the priest? Where was the Caldwell boy? Harding gave no answers. Instead, he declared the chapel grounds cursed, ordered them sealed off by armed guards, and posted a decree in the town square. No one enters, no one speaks of this again. To do so is to welcome what sleeps below. But secrets rot in silence, and this one festered. Whispers spread among the women who'd once tended the altar. They said the boy was seen, days later, walking the hills behind the cemetery. Others swore they heard footsteps in the ashes of the chapel long after the site was burned clean. The constable's daughter went missing that month. When they found her, she was barefoot, humming that same lullaby, and she'd carved one word into her bedroom wall. Again. Then something darker began. Livestock birthed stillborn with human teeth. Wells turned black overnight. A widow found her husband dead in bed, his spine bent backwards as if he'd been praying in reverse. And then came Kiki, the dreams. Town after town. No, to just Ashevale now. Sleepers waking in the middle of the night, clutching their chests, eyes wide, mouths repeating a phrase they couldn't remember learning. He will open the bone door. A preacher from Louisville came to investigate. He stayed one night. By morning, he'd vanished. His horse was found outside Grace Chapel's ruins, facing east, its eyes gouged, and a hymnal nailed to its back. Inside the hymnal, a single page, blank except for 3 words, scorched into the paper as if by flame. He still breathes. The Caldwell boy was gone, but something far older had taken his place. The boy's name had all but vanished from record. No school enrollment, no birth certificate, no grave. Even the church registry where he'd once been baptized had been torn from the ledger. Only a jagged spine of ripped parchment remained. And yet, in the minds of those who had glimpsed him in the final days, he remained unforgettable. They spoke not of a child, but a vessel. He had changed, his skin grown pale and taut like stretched wax, his eyes now dim coals that never blinked. One girl, Ruthie Bell, swore she saw him standing in the cemetery at midnight, arms outstretched, as if welcoming something that was still arriving. She said he didn't speak, but when he turned, the ground behind him opened, not like a sinkhole, but like a mouth. Soon, those who had witnessed the chapel's collapse began to die, one by one. The mill foreman, who'd led the first rescue party, was found nailed to the ceiling of his own barn, his ribs flayed open like wings. The mayor's wife was discovered curled in her root cellar, cradling a pile of chow ash she insisted was their son. She died murmuring in a tongue no scholar could identify, though an archivist claimed it closely resembled an ancient Canaanite curse. Asheville's population began to dwindle, not by migration, but by erasure. Entire family lines blinked out. Mail arrived with no recipients. Homes stood with food still warm on the table, yet no sign of the occupants. Just silence. The sheriff, now gaunt and trembling, kept a journal in the final months. His last entry, scribbled and almost illegible, read, "He walks between the veil and the marrow. His voice is a knell. I can hear it under my skin. I have locked the cellar door, but it knocks, and it knows my name." That was the last anyone saw of him. The town was declared economically abandoned in 1871, but long after the buildings decayed, long after vines clawed over the church ruins and the wind swallowed the cobbled streets, a light could be seen some nights. Not a lantern, not a fire. A cold, flickering white glow pulsing in the spot where the altar once stood, almost like a heartbeat. Those who wandered too close reported, hearing the boy's voice, carried on the wind, whispering a question that burned itself into their dreams. "Do you want to remember what you buried?" Most said no, but a few answered yes. None of them were ever seen again. There's a rumor among Appalachian wanderers, those who hike the overgrown back roads where old maps fail and forgotten churches sleep beneath moss, that if you find the path to Asheville, you must never speak its name aloud. The sound of it, they say, draws his attention. They call him the Hollow Boy, not out of disrespect, but out of terror. Folklorists who've studied regional tales from the 1800s to early 1900s began noticing an anomaly. Nearly 14 Appalachian communities, spanning 4 states, told eerily similar stories. A pale boy, a chapel collapse, a voice that comes from beneath the earth. But each tale varied only slightly, as if someone had been retelling the same myth, adjusting the details, just enough to keep it alive and hidden. One tale from West Virginia spoke of a boy buried alive after a mine explosion. When they pulled his body out weeks later, he was alive and smiling, and every canary in the mine had suffocated in its cage. Another account from a Kentucky hollow tells of a young preacher's son who died of fever in 1874, but was seen months later walking hand in hand with a blind woman who could now see. When asked who the boy was, she only replied, "He remembered what we forgot." Each story ends with the same detail. A town that no longer exists, erased from county records, removed from postal routes, overtaken by wilderness, as though something had swallowed it whole. When researchers attempted to cross-reference survivors, they found almost nothing. But in 1996, a decaying trunk was recovered from an estate sale in North Carolina. Inside was a child's journal dated 1867, the same year the Asheville Chapel collapsed. On the last page, in smeared ink, were the words, "He's not a boy, he's a question, and questions don't die." The page was signed only with a symbol, a spiral drawn backward, a detail that match. Ed carvings on pews pulled from the Asheville ruin in 1922. Some believe the Hollow Boy isn't just a ghost, but a contagion of memory. Once you hear about him, once you speak of him, You become a part of his pattern. He's not a soul trapped in limbo. He's the echo of something that was never meant to be born. A child-shaped riddle the world keeps forgetting and remembering again. The disappearance of Ashvale from official records wasn't accidental. It was surgical. By 1903, a group known only as the Concordians, had quietly purchased land deeds, water rights, and burial licenses across 3 counties where Ashvale might have once stood. Their symbol, a triangle made of interlocking rings, was found etched into foundation stones of what was left of the chapel ruins. And then, just like that, the ruins were gone, bulldozed, buried, replanted with fir trees. But they didn't just erase Ashvale. They erased witnesses. In a chilling letter smuggled out by a journalist in 1928, who vanished days after mailing it, there's a line that stands out like a scream frozen in ink. The boy speaks to the roots beneath us. He teaches the soil to remember. That's why they burned the trees. And burn they did. Entire sections of the Ashvale Valley were set ablaze under the pretense of pest control or soil correction. Locals were relocated, often overnight, their homes declared condemned by county inspectors who never left names. Some families were handed money and told to move east and forget this place ever existed. Those who refused, gone. By the 1940s, stories of the Hollow Boy had faded into the whisper streams of Appalachian folklore, campfire stories, scary tales for children. But deeper in the academic archives, rarely touched, were psychological evaluations of 7 unrelated individuals, all institutionalized between 1913 and 1931. Each claimed the same thing: I saw the boy in the walls. These patients, scattered across Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, had no knowledge of each other, yet each drew identical images during therapy sessions: a chapel with no doors, a boy with hollow eyes, and a bell tower with no bell. One patient, a woman institutionalized in 1922, bit off her own tongue and died from blood loss. But in her final day, she etched a message on the inside of her ward window using a piece of broken mirror. He knows your name if you dream of him. Stop dreaming. The window was removed, archived, and never found again. But now the story is here, spreading again. So ask yourself this: why do some places vanish? Because they never existed, or because something inside them must not be remembered? In 1954, a government cartographer named Emery Vale published a revised topographical survey of Kentucky's lesser-known valleys. But in the margins of his private notebook, never meant for public eyes, was a scribbled phrase next to coordinates that once marked Ashvale's location. The ground hums, my compass spins, something is buried and breathing. Emery Vale disappeared 6 months later. His Jeep was found upside down in a dry creek bed with the doors torn clean off, as if something had ripped them outward from the inside. His body was never recovered, but the official report claimed a flash flood, likely. Locals knew better, because they'd heard the humming too. You see, Ashvale was never a town. It was a containment field, constructed over something ancient, not buried, but rooted, something that could not be killed, only bound beneath symbols and rituals forgotten by modern men. The chapel wasn't built to worship, it was built to suppress. And when the last hymns were silenced, when the last sister hung herself in the orchard, when the hollow boy could no longer be kept in the crypt below the altar, the decay began. We now believe the boy was not a child, not even human. Old sketches recovered from a missionary's travelogue show a shape with no face, no limbs, just the hollow suggestion of a head, like an empty mask wrapped in skin. The locals called it the listener. Not because it spoke, but because it heard what you were afraid to say aloud. They believed it fed not on flesh, but on secrets, and that every confession given in Ashvale's chapel made it stronger. Every whispered sin echoed into the dark beneath the pews, until one day the hollow became deep enough to swallow the entire village. There are rumors of tapes, reel-to-reel recordings from a Cold War experiment, where researchers tried to recreate Ashvale's soundscape. Some who listened went mad. One lit himself on fire while screaming, "He's whispering through my own voice." The experiment was buried, but a copy of one tape surfaced online in 2011. 2 weeks later, the forum thread was deleted, and every user who commented on it, accounts wiped. Ask yourself this: if something can hear your fears, what happens when it begins to speak through you? When the state sent demolition crews to clear what was left of Ashvale in 1962, they thought it would be routine: flatten old foundations, burn debris, pave over the past. But what arrived instead was a team of men in unmarked trucks, wearing black uniforms with no insignias, and speaking in clipped, code-like phrases. They weren't there to demolish. They were there to seal. The men didn't use bulldozers or explosives. They all constructed a concrete dome, 90 feet across, reinforced with layers of copper mesh and an internal lead sheath, technology far beyond public knowledge at the time. And then they left. No paperwork, no announcement. The site was fenced off and surrounded with signs that simply read, "Danger, unstable ground, no entry." But here's the part no one explains. Satellite images from 1974, 1989, and 2003 show the dome shifting. Not sinking, not cracking, shifting, as if, hey, something beneath it was moving. In one frame, it appears to pulse outward by several feet, then retract in the next. The changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, unless you're looking for them. A journalist named Clara Wren was. She spent 12 years tracking anomalies across rural Kentucky. Her last article, titled "The Ashvale Pulses," never reached publication. She submitted it on a Friday. By Monday, the editor received a letter, not from Clara, but from her attorney. Clara had checked herself into Howe St. Cecilia's Psychiatric Institute that weekend, citing auditory hallucinations and unrelenting dread. She believed she could hear something through concrete walls, something trying to escape through forgotten names and childhood memories. The doctors called it schizophrenia, but Clara wasn't delusional. She left behind a notebook locked in a safety deposit box, which her sister later found. It detailed her visits to the Ashvale site, Eyes at Dusk, where she claimed the dome would hum if she whispered her sins into the earth. The more she whispered, the louder it became. On the final page, dated 3 days before her institutionalization, she wrote, "I think I'm its new confessional. I don't speak with my voice anymore. I am only echo. Ask yourself this: if silence was a seal and confession a key, how many sins must be spoken before the door opens again?" The sealed dome in Ashvale wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. A signal, buried in concrete, waiting for ears trained to hear beyond the veil. In the early 1980s, a Cold War surveillance program known as Project Chimera picked up unidentified low-frequency vibrations coming from beneath the Appalachian Basin. Initially, they assumed it was Soviet submarine interference, until they triangulated the signal. It wasn't coming from the ocean. It was coming from beneath the Ashvale Dome. The frequencies weren't random. They were base-patterned, like breathing. slow, deep, and unnatural. The recordings were sent to the NSA, who forwarded them to the Department of Energy, who then handed them off to WIA, a religious organization operating under the Vatican. That's right, a Catholic intelligence wing, known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Veil. They had a term for what was buried there: maledicere corpus, the body that curses, not a demon, not a ghost, something older, something that remembers being worshipped before language was invented. What they found in Asheville, buried by the settlers and masked by time, wasn't a town secret. It was an ancient altar, one that predated the Shawnee tribes, predating even the Mississippian mound builders, and what lay beneath it was not dead, just forgotten, and now remembered. A priest sent to the site in 1983 recorded a brief journal entry before his disappearance. There is a heartbeat beneath the cement. It waits for offerings, shame, grief, betrayal. It's not evil, it's hungry. A week later, his apartment in Baltimore caught fire. The only thing left untouched was the crucifix on his desk, bent backward. So what do you call a thing that feeds on silence, thrives on guilt, and hides beneath concrete and copper? You don't name it. You don't record it. You don't tell stories about it, because every time you do, you feed it. And maybe that's what Asheville always was. Not a town, but a disguise, a skin. And now the skin is rotting, and the thing beneath is listening. By 1985, the federal government had rewritten the Asheville incident into a closed case: chemical contamination, uninhabitable grounds, ecological hazard. But a man named Dr. Eli Harrow didn't buy it. He was a geologist by training, but obsessed with a mythic geography, the belief that ancient civilizations built monuments on fault lines of spiritual significance. He'd studied burial mounds, standing stones, ley lines. But Asheville? Asheville was different. Through underground maps, he discovered that the sealed dome sat a dead center atop a geological void. Not a cave, a chasm, unnaturally symmetrical, perfectly round, 33 meters across, no seismic history, no fault line, just an empty mouth. Harrow illegally entered the site using expired DOE credentials. What he found inside the dome should have been impossible. The temperature dropped 18 degrees. The walls were no longer smooth concrete, but appeared to sweat. The copper seal at the center had tarnished, but around the edges, symbols, not scratched, but grown, organic, branching like veins. He stayed underground for 73 minutes. His voice recorder picked up his breathing, footsteps, and at the 52-minute mark, another voice. Not echo, not human. A deep croaking whisper. This is not your land. This is not your name. He left the recorder and ran. 2 weeks later, Harrow attempted to publish his findings under an alias, but before it reached peer review, he was arrested, then committed to a federal psychiatric facility under the Patriot Act, despite it not yet existing in 1985. That's how far they went to erase Asheville. He died there 11 months later. No visitors, no funeral, just a report, cardiac arrest. But his last journal entry, scribbled on the back of a paper napkin, was found hidden in a book of Psalms. It's not a place, it's a gate, and the dome was not to contain it, but to keep us from hearing it sing. You want to know the real reason Asheville was never rebuilt? Because it isn't done breathing, it isn't done remembering, and it remembers you now, because you've heard its story. The first symptom, You dream in someone else's memory. By the early 2000s, urban explorers began to whisper about the town that eats sound. Asheville had become a legend in online forums, an invisible place unmarked on maps, erased from satellite imagery, but a few had found it, or claimed they had. One post, dated February 7th, 2003, came from a user named NullAttractor. Got in through the old wastewater tunnel, took two friends, never heard them speak again after we passed the second gate. You don't hear your own voice down there, only your breath. And something else. Breathing with you. We left after 11 minutes, but something followed. That user vanished a week later, his account deleted, every photo on his hard drive corrupted except for one, a black and white image showing the entrance to a tunnel. On the concrete wall, in what looked like rust, were the words, "You are inside it." A DARPA memo from 2004, later leaked, made vague reference to an acoustic weaponization anomaly in proximity to Site 53, Asheville. The note mentioned reverse perception zones, areas where sensory input reversed entirely. You heard silence where there was sound, felt warmth when touched by ice, time distortion in memory recall. One operative reported aging 6 months during a 2-hour survey. The memo was quietly buried in a trove of defunded black projects. But in 2009, something unexpected happened. A child was found walking on the outer fence of the Asheville perimeter, alone, silent, covered in soot, barefoot, wrapped in what looked like hospital gauze. No record of his identity, no missing person report matched him. When agents tried to speak to him, he only stared and finally whispered, "It wanted my name. I didn't give it." He never spoke again. That boy remains in federal custody, codenamed Echo 6. Every year, on the same day, August 12th, he carves a spiral into his cell wall, using only his fingernail. 33 spirals so far. Every spiral matches the one carved onto the copper disc beneath the Asheville dome. Still think this is about a town? Asheville is not a town. It never was. It is a trap laid long before you were born. And tonight, if your screen begins to flicker, if the sound drops for just a second. By the early 2000s, urban explorers began to whisper about the town that eats sound. Asheville had become a legend in online forums, an invisible place unmarked on maps, erased from satellite imagery, but a few had found it, or claimed they had. One post, dated February 7th, 2003, came from a user named NullAttractor. Got in through the old wastewater tunnel, took two friends, never heard them speak again after we passed the second gate. You don't hear your own voice down there, only your breath. And something else. Breathing with you. We left after 11 minutes, but something followed. That user vanished a week later, his account deleted, every photo on his hard drive corrupted except for one, a black and white image showing the entrance to a tunnel. On the concrete wall, in what looked like rust, were the words, "You are inside it." A DARPA memo from 2004, later leaked, made vague reference to an acoustic weaponization anomaly in proximity to Site 53, Asheville. The note mentioned reverse perception zones, areas where sensory input reversed entirely. You heard silence where there was sound, felt warmth when touched by ice, time distortion in memory recall. One operative reported aging 6 months during a 2-hour survey. The memo was quietly buried in a trove of defunded black projects. But in 2009, something unexpected happened. A child was found walking on the outer fence of the Asheville perimeter, alone, silent, covered in soot, barefoot, wrapped in what looked like hospital gauze. No record of his identity, no missing person report matched him. When agents tried to speak to him, he only stared and finally whispered, "It wanted my name. I didn't give it." He never spoke again. That boy remains in federal custody, codenamed Echo 6. Every year, on the same day, August 12th, he carves a spiral into his cell wall using only his fingernail. By now, you're probably wondering what happened to Ashevale, why no one talks about it anymore, why it's not on modern maps, why every aerial satellite pass renders the area blurred, as if the pixels refuse to align. That's not an accident. Ashevale wasn't just buried, it was redacted from the human timeline. A town surgically removed from memory like a malignant tumor, cauterized with silence. And the most terrifying part? It worked. Almost. Until you. See, there's a reason you made it this far. The algorithms that push content, the suggestion that led you here, the moment your thumb hovered. That wasn't random. Ashevale wants to be remembered now. The wound is reopening. Let me show you how deep it goes. A military historian named Ellis Brandt traced the coordinates of Ashevale back to 1623. Before Ashevale had a name, the land was marked on a Jesuit map as Terra Mutata, the changed land. The priests stationed nearby went mad within weeks. One wrote that the stars bent the wrong way above the valley. Another cut out his tongue and tried to draw a spiral of doors in his own blood. The doors keep appearing in Ashevale's mythology. The door without a knob. The door with a keyhole shaped like an eye. The door only children can see. But the most disturbing account? In 1991, a government whistleblower described an underground facility beneath Ashevale, abandoned after something came through. He said it was not a creature, not even an entity, but a reversal, a turning inside out of language, time, thought itself. It didn't kill. It unwrote. Whole teams went in, none returned, except one, a technician named Maria Halloran, found 6 months later, aging backward, unable to form coherent speech. She had only one phrase tattooed across her back in hundreds of languages. We are the memory of something that never lived, and now you've heard it. Now Ashevale lives in your mind. The message has reached another carrier.